There is a particular kind of file that never makes it into print. Not because the case was unsolved. Dr. Watson had, over the years, published a good many cases that ended in shrugs and half-answers, but because some cases belonged, in his private judgment, to nobody but the people who had lived them. This was one such file. He had carried it, on and off for 28 years, in a dispatch box that smelled faintly of tobacco, an older paper still, and he had never once shown it to an editor. Tonight he meant to show it to 3 people who already knew most of it, and who would, he suspected, enjoy correcting him. The rain had been falling since 4 o'clock, the steady, unhurried sort that seemed to have no particular grievance against London, and no particular hurry to leave it either, and by the time Watson turned off the Marylebone Road and into the narrow lane behind the tea shop, it had settled into the rhythm of something that intended to last the evening. He did not mind. He had long ago made peace with English rain the way one makes peace with an elderly relative, mildly resigned, occasionally grateful for the company. The tea shop had no sign to speak of, only a painted window and a brass bell above the door that had lost most of its shine sometime around the old Queen's Jubilee, and the woman who kept it, a Mrs. Pemberton, broad and unbothered, had long since stopped asking why 4 grey-haired people took the back room every Thursday and stayed until she wanted to go home. She simply brought the muffins and left them to it, on the understanding, unspoken but perfectly clear, that whatever they discussed back there was not her business, and that the extra shilling Lestrade always left under the pot was. Watson shook the rain from his coat in the little vestibule, hung his hat on the 3rd hook from the left, his hook, though nobody had ever said so aloud, and pushed through the curtain into the back room, where the fire was already lit and the lamp already turned up warm and low, and where 3 faces looked up at him with the particular expression of people who have been waiting just long enough to have opinions about it. "You're late," said Lestrade not unkindly, from the chair nearest the fire, where he had arranged himself with the settled comfort of a man who had spent 30 years standing in doorways and intended to spend his retirement sitting in them instead. "I am on time," said Watson. "You're simply early, which you've been doing since 1881, and which I have decided not to comment on again. You just commented on it. That was a retrospective comment, entirely different category." Mrs. Hudson, from the small settee by the window, made a sound that was not quite a laugh but wished to be taken as one, and set down the mending she had brought. She always brought mending, though nobody had ever seen her finish anything, and Wiggins privately suspected the same sock had been darned in that room for the better part of a decade. She'd gone properly white now, her hair not the silvering grey of a woman merely older, but the soft, settled white of a woman who had stopped minding, and there was a warmth to the way she occupied a room that Watson had noticed increase, if anything, since she had left Baker Street. As though 20 years of tenants and coal deliveries had been a kind of weight, and she had only now, in this small back room with its water-stained ceiling, been permitted to simply sit. "There's a chair for you, Doctor," she said, "and Wiggins has already eaten the good end of the muffins, so mind you say something about that before he pretends he hasn't." "I have eaten," said Wiggins from the corner where he had installed himself with a small wooden case open on his knee. He never came without some piece of clockwork in progress, a habit from the irregular days translated somehow into a respectable trade. "Exactly my fair share, which is to say, more than my fair share, on the grounds that I arrived first, and the muffins do not know the difference between fairness and proximity." He looked, if one studied him properly, very little like the boy who had once known every gutter and doorway between the Strand and Clerkenwell by the particular quality of its shadow. He was heavier now, comfortably so, his hands ink-stained in places where they had once been merely dirty, and there was a small magnifying loop pushed up onto his forehead that he seemed to have forgotten was there. But something in the way he watched a room, cataloguing exits without meaning to, noting who had come in wet and who dry, who had changed their coats since Tuesday, had never quite left him, and never would. "Well," said Lestrade, settling his cup, "are we to have a case tonight, or are we simply going to sit here and let the doctor drip on the good chair?" "I am not dripping," said Watson with dignity, taking the good chair regardless. "And yes, I have brought something." He set the dispatch box on his knee and did not open it at once. This was, all 3 of them understood, part of the ritual, and none of them hurried him for it. The fire shifted and settled. Somewhere beyond the curtain a kettle came slowly up to its boil, and the small domestic sound of it threaded under the rain outside, under the murmur of Mrs. Pemberton moving about the front room, under the particular hush of a Thursday evening that had nowhere urgent to be. "Camden," said Watson at last. 1884. Do any of you recall a music box?" There was a pause, not the pause of ignorance, but the particular pause of people reaching backward through a great many years to a specific shelf. "Vaguely," said Lestrade, frowning. "Wasn't that the one that never went anywhere? No theft, no complaint, no body. I remember thinking at the time it was the least interesting thing to cross my desk in a fortnight, and then I remember it staying uninteresting for rather longer than a fortnight ought to allow." "That," said Watson, "is very nearly the whole of it, and also almost none of it." He opened the box. Inside, folded with the particular care of a man who had refolded it many times over many years, was a thin sheaf of police notes, yellowed now at the edges in the way of paper that has spent decades in dry, undisturbed dark. He drew them out gently, as though they might otherwise crumble, though in truth they had survived a good deal worse handling than this, and would likely survive a good deal more. "A music box," he said, "left on a doorstep in Camden on a Tuesday morning in early spring. No note, no card, no indication of sender or intended recipient beyond the fact that it had plainly been left for the household at that particular address, since it was found squarely upon the step and not simply dropped in the street. The family, the Averys, a modest household, the father a clerk at a shipping office, had no occasion they could name for a gift, expected no parcel, and recognised the box itself from nowhere. And yet—" He paused in the manner of a man who knew precisely the effect of pausing, and Mrs. Hudson, despite 40 years of being married to men who did exactly this sort of thing to a room, still leaned forward very slightly. "And yet," Watson continued, "when it was opened, for they did eventually open it, though not without some debate about whether that was proper, given they did not know from whom it came, it did not play a tune anyone in the house recognised. Mrs. Avery said it stirred something in her, some old feeling she couldn't place, and could offer nothing more useful than that. Mr. Avery said it meant nothing to him whatsoever, and their daughter, who was perhaps 9 at the time, said, and this is recorded more or less verbatim in Lestrade's own notes, though I suspect the constable who took it down improved the grammar, that she thought the box was crying. I remember that part, said Lestrade, with the faint discomfort of a man recalling a detail that had never quite sat right with him. Gave me an unpleasant turn, that did, coming from a 9-year-old. I put it down to imagination and moved on. Cases don't solve themselves on the strength of a child's fancy, and I had 6 others open that month. No, said Watson, they don't. And this one didn't solve itself at all. It simply sat, unclosed, in your files, and travelled with you when you left the force, on the grounds, as you told me once, years later, over a rather worse pot of tea than this one, that it was the only case in your career that had never once made you angry, only curious. You said you liked having one of those. Lestrade said nothing to this for a moment, only looked into the fire with the particular expression of a man being quoted accurately against his will. I may have said something of the sort, he admitted eventually. Wiggins, who had set down his clockwork case entirely now, both hands still, said, Camden, 1884. I'd have been, 11? 12? I knew that street. Knew most of the streets thereabouts, actually, better than the men who were meant to be watching them. There was no boast in this, only the plain accounting of a fact. I don't remember a music box, but I remember the Averys Road, if that's any use to you. There was a lamp on the corner that never lit properly, always half aflame, like it couldn't be bothered to commit to burning or not burning. Used to annoy me something dreadful, the indecision of it. Mrs. Hudson had picked her mending back up, though her needle had gone still in her hand. A music box that made a grown woman feel something she couldn't name, she said quietly, and a child who thought it was crying. That's not nothing, Doctor, whatever the file says about no theft and no complaint. That's a story with no ending stitch to it. No wonder you kept it. No wonder indeed, said Watson, and for a moment none of them said anything at all, and the rain went on outside, patient and unbothered, and the fire settled lower in the grate, and somewhere past the curtain Mrs. Pemberton's kettle, having reached its boil some minutes before and been quite forgotten, began at last gently to sing. The kettle's song rose and fell, and was eventually silenced by Mrs. Pemberton's unhurried footsteps, and a few minutes later she pushed through the curtain herself with a fresh pot and a plate of the muffins Wiggins had not yet managed to finish, set them down without a word beyond there now, and withdrew again, leaving the four of them to the particular privacy that only a good landlady knows how to grant. Lestrade poured. He always poured. It had become, somewhere across the years, his self-appointed office in the room, the way Mrs. Hudson's was the mending, and Wiggins's was the small, mechanical fidgeting that kept his hands occupied while his mind worked. And he did it now with the unthinking care of a man who had once handled evidence, and never quite lost the habit of handling things carefully. "Go on then," he said, settling back. "You've got the notes. Read us what there is, and let's see if between the four of us we can't do better than I managed in '84. Watson smoothed the topmost page against his knee. The ink had browned with age, but the hand was still legible. A young constable's hand, careful and a little cramped. The hand of a man anxious to get everything down correctly and rather too aware of being watched while he did it. "Statement of Mr. Josiah Avery," he read. "Clerk of number 14, Prince of Wales Road, Camden Town, taken the 14th of April, 1884, by Constable Reeve in the presence of Inspector G. Lestrade." He glanced up. "Constable Reeve, do you recall him?" "Vaguely," said Lestrade. "Young fellow, very earnest. Wrote everything down twice if you let him, once in his own words and once trying to sound like a magistrate. I believe he went on to something in the city eventually. Insurance, I think, or was it actuarial work? The sort of career, at any rate, where being thorough to the point of tedium is considered a virtue rather than a trial to one's superior officer. Read the statement, Doctor," said Mrs. Hudson, "and let the poor constable's career rest." Watson smiled and returned to the page. "I state that on the morning of Tuesday the 8th of April, at approximately 7:30, my wife discovered upon our front step a small wooden box, of a kind I understand to be called a music box, of dark polished wood with a brass fitting at the front. There was no note, card, or wrapping of any kind beyond a plain cloth in which the box had evidently been carried, and which had been left folded neatly beside it, as though the person who brought it did not wish it to be mistaken for part of the gift, or perhaps did not wish to be thought careless of the cloth itself." "There," said Wiggins, sitting forward slightly. "That's a curious little detail, that. A man leaves you a present anonymously, and yet troubles himself to fold the wrapping neatly and set it apart, so you shan't think it belongs to the gift. That's not carelessness. That's manners. Somebody minding their manners even in the act of being a mystery." "Or somebody used to folding things," said Mrs. Hudson. "There's a difference. A woman who's spent her life folding linen doesn't stop folding just because she's nervous, is what her hands do." "Both fair," said Watson. "Continue, if—" "I may. We did not recognise the box, nor could my wife or I account for who might have left it, we having received no correspondence indicating a gift was intended, nor any occasion in our household that would prompt one. My wife wished to open it at once. I confess I counselled waiting, on the grounds that a gift from an unknown hand might as easily be some manner of trick or unwelcome jest as a kindness, though I could not myself say why I felt this, the box being, on its face, entirely ordinary and giving no sign of ill intent. "There's the anomaly," said Watson, tapping the page lightly. "He can't say why he felt uneasy. A perfectly ordinary box, by his own account, giving no sign of anything at all. And yet something in him hesitated before opening it. That's the sort of detail a good detective doesn't dismiss simply because the man himself can't explain it." "He needn't have had a reason," said Lestrade, a touch defensively, as though some ancient professional pride had been quietly prodded. "People get feelings about things. I've arrested men on feelings I couldn't have written up properly if you'd paid me, and been right more often than I've been wrong." "I'm not questioning your instincts, old friend," said Watson. "I'm only observing that Mr. Avery's hesitation is worth remembering, because it recurs. Here, further down." When at length we did open the box, some 2 days later, my wife having grown too curious to wait longer and I having found no reason to continue objecting, we found within it the mechanism of an ordinary musical box, which, upon winding, played a tune neither my wife nor I recognised, though my wife stated that it stirred in her some feeling she could not place, as of a memory just out of reach, though she is certain she has never heard the tune before in her life. He let the page rest a moment. "A memory just out of reach," said Mrs. Hudson softly, "that she was certain she'd never had. That's not a small thing to put in a statement to a police constable. Most people, giving evidence, stick to what they saw and touched. They don't offer up their feelings unless the feeling was doing something to them." "Precisely my thought when I first read it," said Watson. "And it's Mrs. Avery's statement that follows, if you'll allow me. briefer than her husband's, but I think the more telling of the two. He turned the page. I do not know the tune, and yet I felt, on hearing it, as though I ought to. This troubles me more than the box's arrival itself, for a stranger leaving a gift is merely strange. But a tune that feels like something lost feels, I confess, like something else entirely, though I could not say what. The room had gone quiet in the particular way it did when a good story found its footing, not the tense quiet of held breath, but the settled, unhurried quiet of people leaning a little closer to a fire. "And the daughter?" asked Wiggins. "You said before, the girl who thought the box was crying." "Emmeline Avery," said Watson, finding the page. "Aged 9. Her statement is shortest of all, and Constable Reeve, bless him, appears to have transcribed it with more sympathy than procedure. The little girl, upon being asked whether she recognised the box or the tune, replied that she did not, but that she did not like the box, because she thought it was crying, and that boxes ought not to cry, and that her mother had gone strange after hearing it, and she wished someone would put it away." "Poor mite," murmured Mrs. Hudson. "Constable Reeve appears to have agreed with you," said Watson, "for he's added, in what I take to be his own hand rather than the girl's words, a small note in the margin. Child appeared genuinely distressed. Query whether tune known to household by some other means. Which, I will say, shows rather more instinct than you gave him credit for a moment ago, Lestrade." "I never said the boy lacked instinct," said Lestrade. "I said he was tedious about writing it down. The two aren't mutually exclusive in my experience. Some of the best detectives I ever knew were dreadfully tedious men who happened to be right." There was a small ripple of laughter at that, the easy, unforced sort that required no explanation and needed none, and Wiggins reached for another muffin with the frank satisfaction of a man who had decided the conversation had earned him one. "So," he said through it, "no theft, no note, no sender, and a tune that unsettled a groan. Woman, and frightened a child, though neither of them had ever heard it before in their lives, or so they say." He paused. "What did your notes make of the box itself, Doctor? Not the tune. The box. Where it came from, who made it, that sort of thing." Watson turned another page. "You anticipate me," he said. "There is, in fact, rather more here than I've read out, and it's this part I think none of us properly discussed at the time, because the case went quiet before we ever got round to it. There's a report, not from Lestrade's men, but appended later, evidently after some correspondence, from a Mr. Aldous Farrow, a dealer in musical instruments and mechanisms with premises off Wigmore Street, whom the Averys apparently consulted privately, some weeks after the police inquiry had gone cold, in the hope of learning something more about the box themselves. "I don't recall that at all," said Lestrade, frowning properly now. "That's not in anything I ever saw." "No," said Watson, "it wouldn't be. By the time the Averys went to Farrow, your investigation had already been closed for want of any crime to investigate. Quite properly, I should say, since nothing had been stolen and no complaint of any real substance had been made. What I have here came to me rather later, and rather differently. Mr. Avery wrote to me himself some years afterward, having read one or two of my published accounts and evidently taken the view that I might succeed where the official channels, with the best will in the world, had reached the limit of what they were empowered to pursue. He enclosed Farrow's report along with his letter on the chance it might interest me. "And did it?" asked Mrs. Hudson. "Enough," said Watson, "that I wrote back, and enough that I mentioned it, eventually, to Holmes, though I confess I did not press him hard on it, and he did not take it up in any formal sense. It was by then an old case with no client pressing for resolution, and no crime on the books to justify his time, and he had, if I recall, 3 considerably more urgent matters occupying him that particular month. But he read Farrow's report. I remember that much clearly because he read it twice, which was, in my experience, not a thing he did without reason." "What did the report say?" said Wiggins, all the fidgeting stillness of him now fully given over to attention. Watson found the relevant page and read it slowly, in the manner of a man who had read it so many times over the years that he half knew it by heart and was reading now more for the pleasure of the words than the need of them. "The box in question," he read, "is of good but not exceptional workmanship, the mechanism German in origin, likely Black Forest manufacture, of a type commonly imported and sold in London through several respectable houses over the past 15 to 20 years, and not in itself remarkable or traceable to a single maker or purchaser with any confidence. The wood of the case, however, is of interest. It has been refinished, That is, the original surface has been sanded back and revarnished, and done, in my professional judgment, by a skilled hand, though not a professional one. A cabinet maker or restorer would have left fewer traces of the work. This was done by someone careful, patient, and evidently fond enough of the object to take real trouble over it, but without the specific training that would have made the work invisible. He paused and looked up. Someone fond enough of the object to take real trouble over it, he repeated. That is the phrase, gentlemen, and Mrs. Hudson, that I have carried in my mind for 28 years. Not a thief disposing of stolen goods, not a stranger's careless prank. Someone who cared for this box, cared for it enough to refinish it themselves, with patience, though without a craftsman's training, and who then left it silently, wrapped with care, on the step of a family who had never seen it before in their lives. The fire cracked softly in the grate. Outside, the rain had settled into something even steadier than before, the sort of rain that seemed less like weather and more like a fact of the evening, a thing that had simply always been happening and would go on happening long after the four of them had gone their separate ways home. "There's a person in that detail," said Mrs. Hudson at last quietly. "Not a mystery. A person. Somebody who loved that box enough to mend it with their own too. Hands. Badly, because they didn't know how to do it properly and didn't want to trust it to anyone who did." "That," said Watson, "was very nearly Holmes's own observation when I showed him the report. Word for word, very nearly. I remember being rather struck by it at the time, and rather more struck now, hearing it fall so naturally from you." Lestrade had set down his cup and was looking into the middle distance with the particular expression of a policeman, running old facts back through a mind that had, in 30 years, learned not to trust a case simply because it looked closed. "So we've a box, sanded and mended by an amateur hand out of what sounds like real affection," he said slowly, "left anonymously, wrapped with care, on the step of a household that had no earthly connection to it that anyone could establish. No theft, no complaint, no motive on the books that made the smallest sense to any of us at the time, and a tune inside it that made a grown woman feel she'd lost something she couldn't name and frightened a child half to tears." He shook his head slowly. "I don't mind telling you, Doctor, I thought about that case more, over the years, than half the ones I actually solved. There was something in it that itched." "An itch is exactly the word," said Watson. "And here is the detail, gentlemen, that I think we ought to sit with a while before we go any further tonight, because it is the detail that never let me alone, and the reason this file has travelled with me for 28 years rather than gathering dust with the others." He turned to the final page of Farrow's report and read the last line slowly, giving each word its own small weight. "I would add, for what it may be worth, that the mechanism, though old, had very evidently been wound and played a good many times before it ever reached the Avery household. The wear upon the spring and comb suggest years of use, not months. Whoever owned this box before it arrived at Prince of Wales Road did not merely keep it. They played it, Mr. Avery, often and for a very long time." Nobody spoke for a moment. The fire settled. Somewhere beyond the curtain, faint and companionable, came the sound of Mrs. Pemberton moving cups about behind her counter, readying to close for the evening, in no hurry at all. "Years of use," said Wiggins at last, half to himself, and then, one Tuesday morning in April, given away to strangers who'd never heard the tune in their lives. He shook his head slowly and reached for the pot to pour himself a second cup, the small mechanical fidget of the motion settling something in him the way it always seemed to. "Somebody parted with something they loved very much indeed, Doctor. I should like to know why." "So," said Watson, folding the pages back together with the same careful hands that had unfolded them, "would I? And so, as it turned out, would Holmes, though not as it happens straight away, and not without rather more persuasion than any of us expected it to take." Watson set the folded pages back into the dispatch box, but did not close the lid, as though some part of him wished to keep the case within easy reach a little longer, and settle back into the good chair with the particular stillness of a man about to tell the rest of a story from memory rather than from paper. "I ought to go back a little further than Farrow's report," he said, "because there is a piece of this that Holmes and I only pieced together some years after the fact, when I went looking, quite privately, for the man who had actually delivered that box to the Averys' step. For someone had to have carried it there, gentlemen, whatever the neighbours claimed to have seen or not seen that morning, and it seemed to me that a box does not walk itself to a doorstep." "You went looking on your own?" said Lestrade, one eyebrow lifting. "Without Holmes?" Holmes was in Cornwall that spring, chasing something involving a stolen deed and a very disagreeable solicitor, and had no time to spare for an old closed case that nobody was paying him to reopen, said Watson. But I had grown curious in the particular stubborn way that a case gets under a man's skin when he has read the same handful of statements too many times, and I had, besides, the advantage of knowing the street a little myself, having walked it once or twice on other business in the years since. So I went to Camden on my own account, and I began as any sensible man begins. Such an inquiry, by asking who had walked Prince of Wales Road at 7:30 every morning for as long as anyone could remember. "The postman," said Wiggins quietly, before Watson could say it himself, and there was something in the way he said it, not a guess but a recognition, the flat certainty of a man who had spent his boyhood learning exactly which figures belonged to which hours of a London street, and had never quite unlearned the habit. "The postman," Watson agreed, though it took me the better part of a week to find him, for by the time I went looking let me think, it must have been 1889 or thereabouts, some 5 years on from the box itself, the old round had been reorganised twice over, and half the men who'd walked it in 84 had moved on to other beats or retired outright. But I found him eventually. A Mr. Aldous. No, forgive me, that was Farrow's name. I've muddled it in my head after all these years of telling it. The postman's name was Cobb, Silas Cobb, and by the time I found him he had walked that same stretch of Camden door by door for very nearly 17 years, and would go on to walk it, I believe, for a good many more after I spoke to him. He paused, and there was for a moment something in his face that was not quite in the file at all. The particular softness of a memory that had outgrown its evidence and become, over the years, something closer to a story he told himself. "Shall I tell it as I found it?" he said, rather than simply reading you what he said. "I think it will serve the case better, and I find, after all these years, that I remember the telling of it more clearly than the words themselves." "Tell it your way, Doctor," said Mrs. Hudson. "We're none of us in a hurry." And so Watson told it, and as he told it, the little back room of the tea shop, the fire, the rain against the window, the 3 familiar faces watching him in the lamplight, seemed to loosen its hold, very gently, on the present, and the story that had been sitting folded in a dispatch box for 28 years began, at last, to breathe. Camden in the spring of 1884 was not, by any account, a fashionable place, though it was not without its own particular dignity. The road called Prince of Wales Road ran between rows of narrow terraced houses, brick gone soft and dark with coal smoke, each with its little iron railing and its scrap of front steps scrubbed white by whichever daughter or maid had been given the job that week, and along it, 6 mornings out of 7, walked a man named Silas Cobb, in a post office uniform 2 sizes too broad across the shoulders, with a leather satchel worn shiny at the strap and a way of walking that never once hurried, whatever the weather, whatever the hour, whatever the weight of the bag on his shoulder that particular morning. He had walked that round by 1884 for the better part of 12 years already, and he would go on walking it, as Watson would later learn, for the better part of 20 more. And in all that time he had come to know Prince of Wales Road and its neighbouring streets the way another man might know the rooms of his own house, not merely the addresses, though he knew every one of those without needing to look at an envelope twice, but the smaller, quieter facts that accumulate around a man who walks the same ground at the same hour every day of his working life. He knew which houses expected letters and dreaded them in equal measure. He knew which curtains twitched when he passed, and which never stirred at all. He knew the exact week each spring when the lilac in the Priddy's back garden came into flower and could be smelled clear out to the road, and he knew, with the quiet, unbothered certainty of a man who has simply paid attention for a very long time, that something on that street had, for some years now, not been quite as it seemed. It concerned, though he could not for a long while have put a name to it, the house at the far end, number 2, which stood a little apart from the terrace proper, older than its neighbours, and set back from the road behind a low brick wall, occupied for as long as Cobb had walked the round by an elderly woman named Mrs. Elspeth Carraway, a widow of some private means, who received very little post of any kind. The occasional letter from a sister in Yorkshire, a bill or 2, nothing that marked her out from any other quiet, solitary old woman, keeping her own small household on her own small income, except that on most Tuesday evenings, a little before dusk, a young man came to her door. Cobb did not, of course, see this himself, his round being a morning one, but he heard of it in the particular way that a postman hears of everything eventually, from the boy who delivered the coal and from Mrs. Priddy 2 doors down, who had opinions about most things and had formed several about the young man in question, none of them especially charitable, though she could never quite say what specifically she objected to beyond the general principle that a young man calling regularly upon an elderly widow, however respectably, was the sort of thing that ought to be noticed and discussed at some length over the garden wall. Cobb had never much cared for Mrs. Priddy's opinions on the subject. He had, in the way of a man who watches a street quietly and thinks about what he sees rather than simply repeating it, formed a rather different view, that the young man, whoever he was, came and went at respectable hours, always on foot, always alone, always carrying nothing more alarming than what appeared, from a distance, to be a small case or parcel under one arm, and always, without exception, leaving Mrs. Carroway's house with a lighter step than the one he'd arrived with. It was, Cobb thought privately, none of his business, and he might never have thought of it again at all had it not been for the morning, some months on, when he noticed that the young man had stopped coming. He noticed it the way he noticed everything on his round, not all at once, but gradually, the absence accumulating week by week until it became, itself, a kind of presence. A Tuesday without the young man's step on the road. Then another. Then, some weeks later, Cobb delivered to number 2 a black-bordered envelope from the undertaker's office 2 streets over, and understood, with the plain, unsentimental grief of a man who has delivered a great many such envelopes over the years and never quite grown hardened to it, that Mrs. Carroway had died. He mentioned it to no one in particular, because there was no one in particular to mention it to, and continued his round and thought, from time to time, in the idle way a man thinks of small unfinished things, about the young man who had stopped coming on Tuesdays, and wondered, without any real expectation of an answer, what had become of him. It was, as it happened, several months later, the following spring in fact, the spring of 1884 itself, that Cobb saw him again, and this time not at Mrs. Carroway's gate at all, but standing early one grey morning on the corner of Prince of Wales Road itself, some considerable distance from the house he had once visited so faithfully, looking, Cobb thought, like a man who had walked a long way to reach a place he was no longer sure he ought to be standing in. He was perhaps 25, thin in the particular way of a man who has not been eating quite regularly, in a coat that had once, Cobb judged, been a good coat, and had since been worn a great deal harder than it was built for, and he was carrying, wrapped carefully under one arm in a plain cloth, a small wooden box. Cobb, being a postman, and therefore a man for whom small wooden boxes and plain cloth wrappings were the ordinary furniture of the working day, thought nothing of it beyond a passing professional curiosity, and might have walked straight past with no more than his usual nod of the head, had the young man not spoken to him. "You walk this street every morning," the young man said. It was not quite a question. "Near enough 30 years one way or another," said Cobb, not unkindly, for there was something in the young man's face, a kind of exhausted carefulness, the look of a man who had rehearsed a thing many times over and was now finally forcing himself to say it, that stopped him from simply moving on. "There's a house," said the young man, "number 14, the Averys. Do you know it?" "I know it," said Cobb. "Deliver there most weeks. Nothing much of interest. A bill now and then. The odd letter for Mrs. Avery from her sister out at Reading." The young man nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something he had already half suspected, and looked down at the box under his arm, and for a long moment said nothing at all, and Cobb, who had learned over 30 years of doorsteps and doorways that the kindest thing a man could sometimes do was simply wait, waited. "I want to leave something for them," the young man said at last, "anonymously, no note. I don't want them to know who it's from, and I'd be grateful if you wouldn't ask me why, because I find I can't properly explain it, even to myself, though I've tried a good many times over the past month to work out how I'd say it if anyone did ask." Cobb considered this for a moment, in the unhurried way that was, by then, entirely his own, a way of turning a thing over slowly, without alarm, without rushing to judgment, that had served him well over 3 decades of a job that brought a man into daily, glancing contact with more small human oddities than most people encountered in a lifetime. "I'm not in the habit of delivering parcels that aren't addressed proper through official channels," he said, "on account of it not being my place, and the post office having views about that sort of thing that I'm paid to respect." The young man's face fell, very slightly, in a way that suggested this was not an unexpected answer, but had been hoped against regardless. "But," Cobb went on, "I don't suppose there's any rule of the post office that says a man can't set a parcel down on a step with his own 2 hands on his own time, before his round starts, same as any other citizen of London might do, if he'd a mind to." He paused. "I generally take a cup of tea at the stand by the corner before I start my morning proper, 7:30 most days. If a parcel happened to find its own way onto that step sometime before then, I couldn't rightly say who'd put it there." Something moved in the young man's face then. Not quite relief, not quite gratitude, but something adjacent to both. The particular loosening of a man who's been carrying a decision for a long time and has just been given, unexpectedly, a small and gentle way to set it down. "Thank you," he said, and his voice, Cobb noted, was not quite steady when he said it. "No need to thank me," said Cobb. "I've not done anything. I've had a cup of tea, same as any other Tuesday." He looked for a moment at the box under the young man's arm, and though he asked no direct question, something in his face must have carried the shape of one, because the young man, unprompted, answered it anyway. "It was hers," he said quietly. "Mrs. Carraway's. She left it to me in the end, along with 1 or 2 other small things, though I don't think she meant the box the way the solicitor read it. I think she meant it for someone else entirely, and never got round to saying so before she went, and I've spent the better part of a year trying to work out what to do with a thing I've no right to and can't bring myself to sell, and can't bear to simply keep, sitting in a drawer, playing a tune that isn't mine to be sentimental about." "And the Averys," said Cobb gently. "What have they to do with it?" The young man was quiet for a long moment, looking down the grey length of the road toward number 14, its curtains still drawn against the early hour, its step not yet swept for the day. "I couldn't rightly say," he admitted at last. "Only that it seemed somehow that it ought to go there, and I've learned this past year not to argue too hard with the things that seem to want doing, even when I can't explain why they want doing the way they do." And with that, Cobb would recall all those years later, when Watson at last tracked him down and sat with him over a cup of tea not unlike the one they were all drinking now. The young man had thanked him once more, quietly, and turned and walked away down Prince of Wales Road in the grey early light, and Cobb had never seen him again, not once, in all the years that followed, though he had thought of him now and then on quiet mornings, and wondered, without any particular urgency, what had become of him, and what had become of the box, and whether whatever it was the young man had been carrying. For Cobb had understood even then, without being able to say precisely how, that the box was not really the heaviest thing the young man had been carrying that morning, had ever in the end been set down properly. Watson let the story settle a moment before he spoke again in his own voice, and the fire had burned low enough now that Lestrade rose without being asked, and put another small shovel of coal to it, the domestic, unhurried gesture of a man perfectly at home in a room that was not strictly his own. "That," said Watson, "is very nearly word for word how Cobb told it to me, some 5 years after the fact, sitting in his own small kitchen with his wife pouring tea rather better than mine, I'll confess, than what Mrs. Pemberton serves us here, though I'd never say so where she could hear it." "A young man," said Mrs. Hudson slowly, "carrying a dead woman's music box that he thought she'd meant for somebody else, and choosing, of all the doors in London, that one." She shook her head, not in disbelief but in the particular wondering way of a woman turning a puzzle piece over in her hand, feeling its edges. "There's a whole story sitting behind that choice, Doctor. He didn't pick number 14 out of a hat." "No," said Watson, "he did not. And that, gentleman, is very nearly the exact point at which my own inquiry stalled for a number of years, because Cobb, kind and observant as he was, had never learned the young man's name, nor asked after Mrs. Carraway's household beyond what a postman naturally comes to know of any address on his round, and by the time I thought to go looking for further particulars of the widow herself, a good deal of time had passed, and the trail, such as it was, had gone cold in the particular stubborn way that private griefs tend to go cold, not vanishing exactly, but retreating behind the closed doors of people who have no earthly reason to speak of them to a stranger. "But you didn't leave it there," said Wiggins. It was not a question either. "No," said Watson, with something that might, in a younger man, have been called a small smile. "I did not, though it was, in the end, not myself who found the thread that led onward, but Holmes, and rather more reluctantly than either of us expected, given how little the case appeared, on its face, to merit his particular attention." He reached for his tea, found it gone cold and set it down again without much complaint, the way a man does when the temperature of his tea has become, over the course of an evening's storytelling, entirely beside the point. "I ought to explain," he said, "how it was I finally persuaded him to look at it at all, for it was not, I confess, an easy persuasion, and it involved, if I recall correctly, rather more of Mrs. Carroway's own history than I have told you yet, and a good deal of Mycroft besides, which is not a sentence I have often had occasion to say about a case with no crime in it whatsoever." Lestrade, settling back into his chair with the coal now catching properly and the fire climbing warm and orange again, gave a short disbelieving laugh. "Mycroft," he said, "over a music box with no theft attached to it. Now that I should like to hear." "You shall," said Watson, "though it will keep a little longer, I think, for Mrs. Pemberton's clock says it's later than any of us noticed, and my throat, gentlemen, after all that, could use a second pot before I go any further." And Mrs. Hudson, setting down her mending at last with the air of a woman well satisfied with an evening's work, rose to fetch it herself, while outside the rain went on, steady and unbothered, over the wet black roofs of Marylebone, and the fire, freshly fed, settled into the low, contented murmur of a room in no hurry at all to end its evening. Mrs. Hudson returned with the second pot, and the small ceremony of pouring and settling repeated itself, unhurried, before Watson picked the thread back up exactly where he had let it fall. "You'll understand," he said, "that by the time I brought this to Holmes properly, this would have been late in '89, some 5 years after Cobb's story, and some months after I'd first heard it from his own lips. I had very little to offer beyond an old closed file and an old postman's recollection of a young man he'd met once, on a grey morning, and never seen again. No name, no address, no crime, strictly speaking, for there is no statute in England against leaving a gift on a stranger's doorstep, however peculiar the manner of it. I laid the whole of it before Holmes on a wet evening not unlike this one, and I will confess he heard me out with considerably less enthusiasm than I'd hoped for." "He turned you down," said Lestrade, not without a certain satisfaction, the satisfaction of a man who had occasionally been on the receiving end of Holmes's disdain for cases beneath his notice, and took some comfort in learning he'd not been alone in it. "He did rather more than turn me down," said Watson. "He informed me at some length that a case with no crime, no client, no material stake, and no prospect of intellectual challenge beyond a sentimental young man's private embarrassment, his words, not mine, was precisely the sort of matter he had spent a good deal of effort training himself not to be distracted by, and that if I wished to indulge my own curiosity on the subject, I was welcome to do so on my own time, but that he had, that particular month, 3 considerably more pressing matters occupying the whole of his attention, one of which, if you'll recall, involved a Balkan attaché and a missing naval treaty, and was rather more urgent than a music box 5 years cold." "So how did you manage it?" asked Wiggins, leaning forward, the small clockwork case now entirely forgotten on his knee. "You said Mycroft came into it." "I am coming to that," said Watson, "though I ought to say first that I very nearly let the matter drop entirely that evening, and might have done, had it not been for one small detail I happened to mention almost as an afterthought on my way out of the sitting-room, more out of habit than any real hope of it landing anywhere." He paused, and there was again that faint softening in his face, the storyteller's pleasure in arriving finally at the turn he had been walking toward all along. "I mentioned the widow's name," he said. "Carroway, Elspeth Carroway of Camden. I said it, I think, purely because it was the one solid fact in the whole affair, the one thread with a name attached to it, and I remember Holmes was half turned away from me already, reaching for his violin, entirely done with the conversation as far as he was concerned, and he stopped." "Stopped how?" said Mrs. Hudson. "Stopped the way he stopped for very few things," said Watson. "Entirely still, bow half raised, and after a moment he said, without turning round, 'Carroway, Elspeth Carroway, say that again.' And I said it again, rather baffled, and he set the violin down, untouched, unplayed, which was, in itself, a thing I had learned over the years to take seriously, and said, 'Watson, I believe you have brought me, quite by accident, the single most interesting thing that has crossed my desk this month, and I am ashamed to say I very nearly sent you away without hearing it.'" Lestrade let out a low whistle. Now that's not a name I'd have expected to mean anything to him, a widow in Camden, keeping herself quietly on a small income. What in the world did he know of her? Nothing directly, said Watson, but he knew, or half remembered, that the name had crossed his brother's desk once years before, in some quite different connection entirely, and being Holmes, and being constitutionally incapable of leaving a half-remembered thread unpicked, he sent a note round to Mycroft that very night, and had a reply, a rather terse one, as Mycroft's replies to his brother's private curiosities generally were, by the following afternoon. And what did it say? Asked Wiggins. It said, Watson replied, that Mrs. Elspeth Carroway, widow of Camden, had once, a great many years before, some 30 years before, in fact in the middle 1850s, been party to a small but genuinely delicate matter, involving a modest sum of money entrusted to her late husband's care on behalf of a mutual acquaintance's family, a sum which had, through no dishonesty on Mr. Carroway's part, but through a run of simple misfortune in a failed investment, been very nearly entirely lost. It was the sort of quiet financial embarrassment that ruins no one outright, but shadows a family's reputation for a generation if it becomes generally known, and Mycroft, whose memory for such things was, as ever, considerably longer and more precise than seemed strictly fair to the rest of humanity, recalled it only because the family on the losing end of that old misfortune had, at the time, been connected, distantly but genuinely, to a matter of some minor diplomatic sensitivity that had crossed his own desk decades later, quite unrelated, and the name had simply lodged itself in the part of his mind that never seemed to let anything go. The Averys, said Mrs. Hudson quietly. It was not quite a question either, but there was enough uncertainty in it that Watson answered as though it had been one. Not the Averys themselves, no, not directly. Josiah Avery, the clerk of Prince of Wales Road, was, as far as anyone could establish, entirely unconnected to that old affair by blood or acquaintance. But his wife, said Watson, and here he allowed himself the smallest pause, the storyteller's courtesy of letting a fact land properly before building on it. His wife, Mrs. Avery, born a Miss Frobisher before her marriage, was the granddaughter of the very family whose money Mr. Carroway had lost all those years before. The fire cracked. Lestrade set his cup down slowly, and Wiggins, for the first time all evening, had gone entirely still. So, said Wiggins, working it through aloud in the careful, deliberate way of a man assembling a clock from parts laid out on a table, Mrs. Avery grew up in a family that had been quietly, privately ruined, not destroyed, but shadowed, embarrassed, made smaller than it ought to have been, by a mistake Mrs. Carroway's own husband made 30 years before she ever married Josiah Avery or came to live on Prince of Wales Road at all, and Mrs. Carroway carried that shame with her for the whole of her life afterward, evidently, if it was still weighing on her when she died. That, said Watson, was very nearly Holmes's own reconstruction, arrived at within perhaps 20 minutes of Mycroft's note reaching us, and I remember watching him pace the length of the sitting room at Baker Street, with that particular light in his eye that told me, whatever he'd said the evening before about sentimental young men and no material stake, he had entirely changed his mind about the case's worth. But it still doesn't explain the young man, said Lestrade, frowning properly now, the old policeman's instinct for the gap in a story asserting itself, nor how a woman's private guilt over her late husband's failed investment, 30 years gone, ends up as a music box on a doorstep. Where does he fit? The fellow Cobb met on the corner. That, said Watson, was the very question Holmes put to Mycroft next, and it took rather longer to answer, because it required Mycroft to dig considerably further back than a single diplomatic file, into the sort of quiet, unofficial knowledge that exists nowhere in any government record and lives only in the memory of people who happened to have been paying attention at the time. But he managed it, eventually, as he generally did, and what he found was this. He drew a second, thinner sheet from the dispatch box. A letter, Watson explained, that he had copied out himself from Mycroft's original, which had, in accordance with Mycroft's own particular habits, been burned within the week of its being read, on the grounds that he saw no reason for private matters to linger in written form any longer than was strictly necessary. Mrs. Carroway, Watson read, had no children of her own. Her marriage, though evidently a contented one by all accounts, had been childless, and upon her husband's death, some years before the events of 1884, she had taken, in a quiet and informal way, an interest in the son of a former housemaid of hers, a boy named Thomas Halloway, whose own mother had died young, and whose father had gone abroad seeking work and never properly returned. Mrs. Carroway had, in effect, though never formally raised him from the age of perhaps 9 or 10, paid for what education could be managed, and treated him, in every practical sense but the legal one, very nearly as a son. "Halloway," said Wiggins slowly. "That's the young man on the corner, then? The one who spoke to Cobb?" "That is who Holmes and I believed him to be, yes," said Watson, though it took some further weeks of quiet inquiry to confirm it properly, and I'll come to how we did that presently. But consider for a moment what this meant for the shape of the whole affair. A boy raised by a woman who had carried silently, for the better part of 30 years, the private shame of her late husband's failed judgment, a shame that had cost another family, the Frobishers, a measure of standing and security they never fully regained, though the fault, strictly speaking, had never been dishonesty, only misfortune poorly managed. A shame Mrs. Carroway evidently never spoke of to anyone she didn't have to, and certainly never to the boy she raised as her own. And yet a shame he must, somehow, in the last months of her illness, have come to learn of anyway, whether from something she said in her final confusion, or something he found among her papers after her death, or simply some fragment of the old story he'd overheard as a boy and never fully understood until much later. And the box, said Mrs. Hudson softly, was hers, something she'd owned and loved and played for years, that he inherited along with whatever else she left him. And once he knew the truth of what her husband's mistake had cost the Frobisher family, he couldn't bear to simply keep it. Not when he knew, now, exactly whose granddaughter was living not 2 miles away, married and settled and utterly unaware that anything had ever gone wrong. "That is very nearly what Holmes concluded," said Watson, "and I confess I have never, in all the years since, heard it put more plainly or more kindly than you have just put it yourself." Lestrade shook his head slowly, not in disagreement, but in the particular wondering way of a man who has spent 30 years assuming the worst of most anonymous gestures, and finding, now and then, that he had been wrong to. "A boy giving away the one thing he had left of the woman who raised him," he said, because he couldn't stand the idea of keeping something that reminded him his family, the family that raised him, if not the family that bore him, had cost somebody else so dearly all those years before. That's not a crime, Doctor. That's not even properly a mystery, not in the sense I spent 30 years chasing. That's just a young man trying to put something right that was never rightly his to put right in the first place, and not knowing any better way to do it than to leave it quietly on a doorstep and walk away before anyone could thank him for it, or worse, forgive him for a thing he hadn't actually done. "Yes," said Watson quietly, "that is very nearly the whole of it. And it is, I think, the reason this case has stayed with me all these years, in a way that a good many cleverer, bloodier ones have not. There was no villain in it anywhere, gentlemen. Only a young man carrying a weight that had never belonged to him, and trying, in the only way he knew, to set it down gently, in the right place, without being seen to do it." The rain had eased somewhat while he spoke, softening from its steady drumming to something gentler against the window, and Wiggins, breaking the small stillness that had settled over the room, reached at last for the last of the muffins and turned it over once in his hand before setting it back on the plate, evidently having decided for once to leave something for someone else. "You still haven't told us," he said, "how you and Holmes confirmed it was this Halloway fellow at all, nor what became of him afterward. Nor," he added, with the faint deliberate mischief of a man steering a story he already suspected the shape of, what Holmes actually did about a case that had, by his own account, no crime and no client and nothing whatsoever to be solved in any way a magistrate would recognise. Watson smiled and reached again, unhurried, for the dispatch box. "That, my dear Wiggins," he said, "is precisely where the story becomes, I think, rather more interesting than anything I've told you yet. And it involves, I ought to warn you, a good deal more of Camden streets than even you knew as a boy, and one particular gentleman neither of us has mentioned yet tonight, though he is, in his own quiet way, very nearly as important to how this all resolved as Mycroft himself." Watson drew the dispatch box a little closer and settled deeper into the good chair, and there was, in the set of his shoulders, the particular ease of a man who had told this story perhaps only once or twice before in his life, and had found, somewhat to his own surprise, that the telling of it grew easier rather than harder with age. "You'll recall," he said, "that Cobb had described the young man to me only in the vaguest terms, 25 or thereabouts, thin, a good coat worn hard, and a manner about him that suggested a man carrying something heavier than the box under his arm. That was, in itself, not a great deal to go on. 5 years after the fact, and Holmes said as much when I laid it before him, though by then his objection was no longer to the case's worth, but to the practical difficulty of finding one particular young man in a city of 4 million souls on the strength of a postman's 5-year-old memory of a single grey morning. "And yet you found him," said Mrs. Hudson. "We found him," Watson agreed, though not, I will confess, through any particular brilliance of Holmes's deduction, but through the much simpler expedient of Mycroft's records office turning up a name, and Holmes then doing what he did best, which was to take a name and a rough age and a known connection to a household, and work outward from there until the shape of a man's whole recent life became visible. Thomas Halloway, it transpired, had gone, some 3 years after Mrs. Carroway's death, into a clerkship of his own, not so different, in fact, from Josiah Avery's own trade, which Holmes remarked upon with some interest, as though it confirmed something about the boy's temperament that he had already half suspected. A modest position, with a firm of shipping agents down near the docks, steady but unremarkable, the sort of employment a careful, conscientious young man takes when he has no family fortune behind him, and no particular ambition beyond honest, quiet usefulness. "That sounds a very great deal," said Wiggins slowly, "like a young man trying to build himself a life that wouldn't cost anybody else anything at all." Watson looked at him with something that might, in a less composed man, have been called surprise. "You have arrived, in one sentence, at precisely the conclusion it took Holmes the better part of an afternoon's pacing to reach," he said, "though I dare say it took you rather less effort, having known a good many young men in circumstances not unlike Halloway's own." Wiggins shrugged, though there was something careful in the gesture, the particular modesty of a man who did not much like being reminded, even gently, of the boy he had once been. "I knew plenty of lads," he said, "who came up out of nothing much, one way or another, and spent the whole of their growing up trying to work out how to owe the world as little as possible, on account of feeling they'd already been given more than their fair share of charity and didn't much care for the feeling of it. Some of them turned it into meanness, some of them turned it into the opposite, into a kind of carefulness about never taking more than they gave, never leaving a debt unpaid, even debts that weren't rightly theirs to begin with. I'd say your Halloway sounds like the second sort." "He was," said Watson, "very much the second sort, as it turned out, and I think it worth pausing on that a moment, because it was precisely this quality in him, this instinct toward quiet, unspoken repayment, that led Holmes and myself, once we had traced his employment and his lodgings, to the last piece of the puzzle, which concerned not Halloway himself directly, but the manner in which he had learned of the Frobisher connection at all." "You said before," Lestrade put in, "that you thought he might have found it in her papers, after she died, or overheard some fragment of it as a boy and pieced it together later." "That was my supposition at the time," said Watson, "and it was, as it turned out, half right and half wrong, in a manner I did not expect, and which I think, of everything in this whole affair, moved me most when I finally learned the truth of it." He paused and reached for the dispatch box once more, though this time it was not a police statement he drew from it, but a small worn card, a calling card yellowed at the edges, the printed name upon it faded nearly to nothing. There was, he said, a third party to this whole affair whom neither Cobb nor the Averys nor Mrs. Carroway's own solicitor had thought to mention to anyone, for the simple reason that his part in it seemed, to each of them separately, entirely unremarkable. A small ordinary fact of the household not worth remarking on to a policeman investigating a music box with no crime attached. His name was Mr. Ezra Thorne, and for the better part of 40 years he had been Mrs. Carroway's solicitor, and before that her late husband's, and it was Thorne. Old, precise, and utterly discreet in the particular manner of a man who has spent a lifetime being trusted with other people's secrets, and never once betrayed that trust for gossip's sake, who had, in the final year of Mrs. Carroway's illness, when her mind had begun to wander, and her tongue, as sometimes happens with the very old and the very ill, had grown looser than it had ever been in health, heard her speak more than once of the Frobisher money, and of her husband's mistake, and of a guilt she had evidently carried in complete silence for the better part of 3 decades, without ever once unburdening herself of it to a living soul. "And Thorne told the boy," said Mrs. Hudson very quietly. "Thorne told the boy," Watson confirmed, "though not, I think, carelessly, and not without a great deal of private deliberation first. When Holmes and I finally traced him, an old man by then himself, retired from active practice but still occupying rooms not far from his former office, the sort of solicitors' rooms that smell forever of dust and old deed boxes, however many years since a deed was last drawn up in them. He told us the whole of it himself, quite willingly, once he understood we meant the boy no harm and had no intention of making trouble of any kind for anyone. Watson set the calling card down on the arm of his chair, gently, as though it were rather more fragile than a scrap of old pasteboard had any right to be. He said that in the last weeks of Mrs. Carroway's life, sitting with her as he often did, more from long friendship than from any remaining legal necessity, she had said to him, and I believe I can give you very nearly her own words, for Thorne had turned them over in his mind so many times in the years since that he had them, by the time we spoke to him, almost by heart. She had said, "Ezra, I have done that family a wrong I never found the courage to put right, and I am dying without having found it, and I do not know what is to be done about that now, except to hope that somebody, some day, finds it in themselves to do what I did not." The little back room had gone very still. Even Wiggins's hands, which had returned at some point to the small clockwork case on his knee, had gone motionless. Thorne told us, Watson continued, that he had turned that sentence over for a long while after her death, uncertain whether it was his place to act on a dying woman's half-formed regret, or whether the kindest thing, the most discreet thing, the thing a good solicitor of the old school was trained above all else to value, was simply to let the matter rest with her, unspoken, and let old griefs stay buried where they had been buried for 30 years already. But Halloway, he said, had come to him not long after the funeral, in the ordinary course of settling the small estate, and had asked him, gently but plainly, whether there was anything in Mrs. Carroway's affairs that troubled her at the end, anything he ought to know of, because the boy had sat with her himself in her final days and had heard enough of her wandering half-finished sentences to know that something weighed on her, though he could make no proper sense of it at the time. "And Thorne told him," said Lestrade. "Thorne told him," said Watson, "not all at once, and not, I think, without a great deal of private struggle over whether it was right to do so. But he told him, in the end, because he judged, rightly as it turned out, that Halloway was precisely the sort of young man who would rather carry a difficult truth than be spared it, and precisely the sort who, once he knew it, would not be able to simply set it aside and go on with his life as though he hadn't." Mrs. Hudson had set her mending down entirely now, her hands folded in her lap, and there was something in her face, not quite tears, but close enough to their neighbourhood that she blinked once, briskly, before speaking. So he learned, all at once, at perhaps 22, that the woman who had raised him as her own, the only mother he'd properly known, had spent her whole life quietly ashamed of a wrong her husband had done to a family the boy had never heard of, and had no earthly connection to himself, she said. And instead of simply grieving her and letting the old story die with her, the way most people would have done, and nobody would have blamed him for it, he went looking for the Frobisher granddaughter instead, and found her, married and settled under a new name in Camden, and spent— "How long, Doctor? A year, you said, refinishing that box himself?" "The better part of a year," said Watson. Thorne believed, from what little Halloway had said to him during that time, that the boy had first thought simply to write to the family, or to send some sum of money by way of restitution, though he had precious little of his own to send, being a young clerk of modest means. But he came to feel, apparently, that money was the wrong instrument entirely, that it would only draw attention to a shame nobody living had actually caused, and stir up a story the Averys themselves knew nothing of and had no reason ever to learn, and so he settled instead on the box. "Why the box, though?" said Wiggins. "Of all the things he might have chosen, why give away the one object he had left of the woman who raised him, rather than keep her memory and find some other way to make his peace with it?" Watson considered this a moment before answering, and when he did, his voice had gone quieter, in the particular way of a man arriving at the part of a story he found hardest to tell well. "I asked Holmes very nearly that same question," he said, "on the evening we finally laid the whole of it out together back at Baker Street, and he gave me an answer I have never forgotten, though I have turned it over a great many times in the years since and am still not entirely certain I understand it as fully as he did. He said that a man carrying a guilt that is not his own cannot simply set it down by an act of will, however much he might wish to. That guilt of that particular kind, inherited rather than earned, has a way of lodging itself in the body rather than the mind, and will not be reasoned away, however sound the reasoning. It wants, he said, an object, a gesture, something the hands can do that the mind alone cannot manage, and the box being the one thing that connected him most directly and most tenderly to the woman whose guilt he had inherited, was, in a strange way, the only object substantial enough to carry the weight he needed to set down. To give away anything less would have felt, he thought, like a gesture too small for what he was actually trying to do. "He gave away his grief," said Mrs. Hudson softly, "disguised as a gift." "Very nearly," said Watson, "very nearly exactly that." The fire had burned low again, and Lestrade rose once more without comment to feed it, and for a moment nobody spoke, the four of them sitting in the particular companionable silence that settles over people who have, together, arrived at the tender centre of a story and are none of them in any hurry to disturb it by speaking too soon. It was Wiggins, eventually, who broke it, though gently, and with something in his voice that suggested he had been waiting to ask the question for some while. "What became of him?" he said. "Halloway. Did you and Holmes ever speak to him yourselves? Did he ever know that anyone had gone looking all those years on and worked out what he'd done?" Watson was quiet a moment before answering. "That," he said, "is the part of the story I've always found hardest to tell and easiest to remember, both at once, and I think, if you'll permit me, I would rather tell it to you properly in its own time than rush to the end of it now, for it deserves, I think you'll agree when you hear it, a little more room than the hour we've left ourselves tonight." Lestrade, settling back into his chair by the newly stoked fire, glanced up at the small clock on Mrs. Pemberton's mantel and gave a short, rueful laugh. "He's not wrong," he said. "It's gone 9:30, and I promised Mrs. Lestrade I'd not make a habit of coming home smelling of coal smoke and muffins past 10 again this month." "Then we'll leave Halloway where he stands," said Mrs. Hudson, gathering her mending at last with the particular firm gentleness of a woman closing a door she fully intended to open again. "On that street corner, 25 years old, with an empty pair of hands and a lighter step than the one he arrived with. And we'll hear the rest of him next Thursday, Doctor, when the muffins are warm again, and the rain, I don't doubt, will still be at it outside." "Next Thursday," Watson agreed, closing the dispatch box at last, though he did not, Wiggins noticed, quite manage to fasten the clasp, as though some small part of him wished to leave it just slightly open, ready, against the coming week. The following Thursday came in rather differently than the one before it. No rain this time, but a low hanging mist that had settled over Marylebone since morning, and showed no sign of lifting, softening the gas lamps along the road into small blurred halos and muffling the sound of cab wheels until the whole street seemed to be conducting its business at half its usual volume. Watson arrived first this time, for once, and found the back room already warm, the fire laid and lit against the evening chill, and Mrs. Pemberton in the middle of setting down a fresh plate of muffins with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had, over the years, come to take a proprietary interest in whether the Cold Case Club stories were going well. "You've a look about you tonight, Doctor," she said, straightening, "like a man with an ending in his pocket." "I have rather more than that in my pocket," said Watson, patting the dispatch box, "though I'll thank you not to ask me what, on the grounds that the others haven't heard it yet, and I've no intention of spoiling it twice in one evening." Mrs. Pemberton laughed and withdrew, and by the time the bell above the door announced Mrs. Hudson's arrival, followed shortly by Lestrade shaking mist from his collar, and Wiggins arriving last, as he generally did, with the small clockwork case tucked under one arm like a talisman, he could not quite bring himself to leave at home. The fire had caught properly, and the room had settled into its familiar Thursday shape. "Well," said Lestrade, dropping into his chair by the fire with the contented groan of a man whose knees had opinions about damp weather that they did not have about dry, "I've thought of little else all week besides that poor young clerk standing on a street corner with an empty pair of hands. You'd best not have kept us waiting for nothing, Doctor." "I promise you I have not," said Watson, and opened the dispatch box. He drew from it, this time, not a police statement nor a solicitor's letter, but a slim bundle of correspondence tied with a faded ribbon, and held it a moment before beginning, in the manner of a man weighing exactly how much of himself to put into the telling of a thing he had privately turned over for the better part of 30 years. "Holmes and I did not go to Halloway directly," he said. "That was, I think, the first and most important decision either of us made in the whole latter half of this case, and it was Holmes's decision rather than mine, though I confess I would have made the opposite one myself out of sheer curiosity had he not stopped me." "Why not go to him?" asked Wiggins. Surely that was the whole point of the exercise, just to find him, to understand what he'd done and why. It was, Watson agreed, and we had by that stage understood it thoroughly, or very nearly so. But Holmes said to me, and I remember this precisely because it struck me at the time as one of the more unexpectedly gentle things I ever heard him say. He said, "Watson, we have spent some weeks now uncovering a young man's private penance, undertaken quietly and at considerable personal cost, and executed in a manner deliberately designed to leave no trace back to himself. If we now march up to his lodgings and announce that two strangers have taken it upon themselves to unravel the whole of his secret, we shall not be solving anything. We shall be robbing him of the one thing he was trying, at some pains, to give himself, namely, the peace of having done a private good without needing to be thanked, examined or praised for it. The kindest thing we can do for Mr. Halloway now is very possibly nothing at all." "So you did nothing?" said Mrs. Hudson, though there was something in her voice that suggested she already suspected the answer was rather more complicated than that. "Very nearly nothing," said Watson, "which is not, I have come to understand over the years, quite the same thing as nothing at all. We did not seek him out. We did not write to him, nor call upon him, nor make any gesture that would have told him his secret had been found and understood. But Holmes did do one thing, which I did not learn of until some months afterward, and which I think, of everything in this whole case, tells you rather more about the man than any of his more celebrated deductions ever did. He untied the faded ribbon and drew out the topmost letter, the paper thin and soft with handling. He wrote, Watson said, not to Halloway, but to Thorn, the old solicitor, and asked him, as a private favour, and without ever revealing to Halloway that any inquiry had taken place at all, to keep a quiet, distant eye on the young man's circumstances over the following years. Nothing intrusive, nothing that would ever come to Halloway's notice, simply, as Holmes put it in his letter, which Thorn was kind enough to show me a copy of many years later, after Holmes's own retirement, that should Mr. Halloway ever find himself in genuine difficulty, of the sort that a young man without family behind him is, peculiarly vulnerable to, you might see your way to a small anonymous kindness on his behalf, the cost of which I will gladly bear myself, and about which he need never know the source. There was a small silence in the room, the particular silence that follows a fact large enough to need a moment's room to settle in. He paid it forward, said Lestrade slowly, without ever being asked to, and without ever taking any credit for it, exactly the way the boy himself had done. Exactly that, said Watson. And it was, I think, the closest Holmes ever came, in all the years I knew him, to admitting that a case could move him. Not intellectually, which was, of course, his usual and most comfortable register, but in some other way he was rather less accustomed to naming aloud. He never spoke of it again, not once, in all the years afterward, and I only learned the full extent of the arrangement myself when Thorn, by then a very old man indeed, told me of it during that same conversation in which he'd first told us of Mrs. Carroway's dying confession. Wiggins had gone quiet, turning something over privately behind his eyes, and it was Mrs. Hudson who spoke next, gently. "And did it come to anything?" she asked. "The arrangement. Did Halloway ever need it?" "Once," said Watson. "Some 6 years later. This would have been 1890 or thereabouts. The shipping firm he worked for suffered a difficult year, and a number of clerks were let go, Halloway among them, through no fault of his own, simply the ordinary cruelty of a business contracting in hard times. He was, by then, married himself, a quiet, sensible young woman named Grace, a schoolteacher whom he'd met some years before and who seems, from everything Thorn could gather, to have been rather good for him, in the particular way that a steady, kind person is good for someone who has spent a great deal of his life quietly carrying weights that were never his to carry. They had, I believe, one small child by then, or were expecting one. Thorn's memory on that particular point had grown a little uncertain by the time I spoke to him, and the loss of his position, coming as it did, was a genuine and frightening difficulty. "And Thorn stepped in," said Lestrade. "Thorn stepped in," Watson confirmed, "in the quietest way imaginable. He simply happened, or so it appeared to Halloway, to know of an opening at another firm, a rather better position than the one he'd lost, with a solicitor's acquaintance who owed Thorn a small favour of his own, and was glad enough to extend it in this particular direction, never knowing, or needing to know, why. Halloway took the position, did well in it by all accounts, and Thorn's private, occasional watchfulness over him continued quietly, for a number of years afterward, funded as arranged by a man in Baker Street who never once let it be known that he was the one doing the funding. Mrs. Hudson had picked her mending back up at some point, though her needle had gone still again, resting in her lap. "Did Halloway ever find out?" she asked. "Not about the job, perhaps, but about any of it. That two strangers had gone looking all those years before and understood everything, and chosen, out of some private tenderness, to say nothing." Watson was quiet a moment. "Not from us," he said. "Not in any way that either Holmes or I ever intended, at least. But I think, and this is my own private supposition, gentlemen, formed over a good many years of turning this case over in idle moments, rather than anything I could properly prove, I think he came to suspect something, eventually, though perhaps not the whole of it." "What makes you think that?" asked Wiggins. Watson reached into the dispatch box once more and drew out the last item within it. Not a letter this time, but a small folded scrap of newsprint, brittle with age, which he unfolded with particular care. "This," he said, "is an announcement from the Times, dated some 11 years after the events we've been discussing. 1895, if my arithmetic holds. It is, on its face, nothing more than a notice of a small charitable bequest, the sort of thing that fills half a column on any given day, and draws no particular attention from anyone who is not, for reasons of their own, watching closely for a particular name." He read it aloud slowly. "We are asked to record the generosity of an anonymous benefactor, who has this month made a donation in memory of the late Mrs. E. Carraway of Camden, toward the establishment of a small fund for the education of children left in the care of guardians who are not their natural parents, to be administered through the offices of Messrs. Thorne and Whitlock solicitors." He let the paper rest a moment in his lap. "I have never been able to prove it," he said, and Thorne, when I asked him directly, some years later, whether the donor had been Halloway, gave me only the sort of professionally opaque smile that a good solicitor gives when he means you to understand a great deal by saying nothing at all. But I have believed, ever since I first read that notice, that Thomas Halloway, grown by then, established, a father himself, no longer the thin young man on the corner with an empty pair of hands, had, in his own quiet way, come to understand that the debt he'd been carrying had never really belonged only to the Frobisher family at all. That it belonged, in some larger sense, to anyone who had ever been raised by love that wasn't strictly owed to them, and that the truest way to repay Mrs. Carraway's kindness was not to give away the one object that reminded him of it, but to make sure that kindness kept moving outward, to other children, in other circumstances, long after both of them were gone. The fire had burned low again, and nobody moved to feed it for a moment, the four of them sitting in the particular hush that follows a story arriving, gently and without fanfare, exactly where it needed to. "That," said Lestrade at last, his voice a little rougher than usual, "is not the ending I expected, Doctor, when you first opened that box last week and told us about a music box and a lamp that couldn't decide whether to burn." "No," Watson agreed. "It very rarely is with this sort of case. There is no arrest at the end of it, no confession wrung out of a guilty man in a locked room, no clever trap sprung. There is only a young man who inherited a shame that was never his, and who spent the whole of his life in small and mostly invisible ways, setting it down as gently and as thoroughly as he knew how, and two old friends of ours, gentlemen, who watched him do it from a careful distance, and never once let him know they were watching, because they understood that the kindest thing left to do once the mystery had answered itself was simply to let him keep his peace." Mrs. Hudson wiped, quite without embarrassment, at the corner of one eye, and reached for her tea to cover the gesture, though none of them were fooled by it, nor did any of them remark on it. "And the Averys?" she asked after a moment, her voice a little unsteady still. Mrs. Avery, and her strange, unplaceable feeling. Did she ever learn any of it? Did she ever come to understand why that tune felt like a memory she'd never had? Watson shook his head slowly. "No," he said. And that, I think, was exactly as it should be. Whatever old shadow her grandfather's misfortune had cast, however faint, over the family she grew up in, it never reached her directly. She carried, if she carried anything at all, only the barest, most instinctive echo of it, a feeling with no name and no story attached, and I think that was a mercy rather than a loss. The box came to her, in the end, cleansed of everything that had made it heavy for Halloway to carry, and became, for her and her family, simply a pretty thing that played a tune nobody could quite place, and made her daughter, once she was old enough to understand such things properly, feel, though she could never have said why, that she was loved by someone she'd never met. "A memory just out of reach," murmured Mrs. Hudson. "That turned out to be kindness, wearing borrowed clothes. Very nearly, said Watson, folding the old newspaper scrap back into its careful square and returning it, at last, to the dispatch box. Very nearly exactly that. The mist outside had thickened rather than lifted, pressing soft and grey against the tea-shop's small window, and somewhere beyond it London went on about its evening business, unaware, as it generally was, of the small quiet resolutions being reached in back rooms and settled parlours all across it. A solicitor's ledger closed 30 years too late for one woman, but not too late for her memory. A young clerk's private penance folding gradually into an ordinary contented life. A music box playing on in a house in Camden, its true history entirely. Forgotten by everyone who now loved it. "Next Thursday," said Wiggins eventually, breaking the long, comfortable quiet. "I don't suppose you've another one of these tucked away in that box of yours, Doctor. I find I've rather a taste for it now." Watson smiled and closed the dispatch box properly this time, the clasp catching with a small, satisfied click. "I dare say I might find something," he said. "I have kept rather more files than any sensible man should, over the years, precisely for evenings such as this one." For a while after that, nobody said very much at all, and there was no need to. The kind of silence that follows a story well told is not, Watson had come to think over the years, an absence of anything. It is its own particular fullness, the sort of quiet in which four people who have known each other a very long time can simply sit together, each turning some private corner of the same tale over in their own way, without feeling any obligation to fill the space with words. Lestrade was the first to stir, reaching forward to prod the fire with the small brass poker that lived, by long habit, propped against the hearth in that back room and nowhere else, as though it belonged to the Cold Case Club itself rather than to Mrs. Pemberton's establishment. The coals shifted, caught, sent up a brief soft shower of sparks that rose and died against the blackened brick and settled again into their low, steady glow. "I'll tell you what strikes me," he said, "sitting here now, turning the whole thing over. 30 years I gave to the Metropolitan Force, one way and another, and I closed. I don't know, a great many cases in that time, hundreds certainly, and I could not, if you asked me tomorrow, tell you the particulars of more than a handful of them with any real confidence. Names blur, details slip, you start to remember the shape of a case rather than its substance. A theft, a fraud, a nasty business at a warehouse, and the people in it become, God forgive me for saying so, rather less vivid to you than the paperwork was." He shook his head slowly, watching the fire rather than any of them. "But this one, a case with no arrest in it anywhere, no charge ever brought, nothing that ever properly belonged to me at all beyond a few pages in a file I closed within the month. I've thought about this one on and off for over 40 years. There's something in that worth noticing, I think, though I couldn't rightly tell you what." "I think," said Mrs. Hudson after a moment, "it's because the ones that stay with you are never really about the puzzle at all. They're about the people underneath it. You can forget a clever trick easily enough. Lord knows I've heard Dr. Watson's stories often enough over the years to know that a clever trick, however dazzling at the telling, fades soon after. But you don't forget a young man standing on a street corner in the cold, deciding to give away the one thing he had left of the person who loved him, because he couldn't bear the thought of keeping something that had once cost somebody else so much. That's not a puzzle. That's just a person being as good as he knew how to be. In circumstances nobody would have blamed him for handling rather worse." Watson nodded slowly, the dispatch box now closed and settled on his knee, one hand resting on its lid the way a man's hand might rest on the shoulder of an old and trusted friend. "Holmes said something rather similar to me once," he said, though he'd never have put it quite so warmly himself, being constitutionally allergic to warmth of that particular kind, at least in his own voice. He said that the crimes worth remembering were very rarely the cleverest ones. The clever ones were, he said, essentially puzzles wearing human clothes, interesting to solve, forgettable once solved, because the solving was the whole of their worth. But the cases that stayed with a man, he said, were the ones in which the human clothes turned out to be the whole of the matter, and the puzzle itself little more than the excuse that had brought you close enough to see them properly. "That does sound like him," said Wiggins, with the particular fondness of a man remembering someone he had known since boyhood, and had never entirely stopped being a little in awe of. "Cold as a fish on the surface, and then out it comes, some sentence like that, and you realise he's been feeling the whole thing rather more than he ever let on." He felt a great deal more than he let on, said Watson, about a great many things, across all the years I knew him. I sometimes think that was the real secret of his method. Not the magnifying glass, nor the chemistry, nor any of the business the penny papers made such a fuss over, but simply that he paid closer attention to people than almost anyone I ever met, and cared, in his own guarded fashion, rather more about what he found there than he would ever have admitted to a stranger. Mrs. Pemberton put her head round the curtain just then, taking in the low fire and the emptied pot, and the general settled stillness of a room whose evening had run its natural course, and said, in the mild, unhurried way she always did, "I'll be closing up the front in a little while, if that suits, though there's no hurry on my account. Rain's stopped proper now, if any of you were wondering, though there's a fog coming up off the canal that'll want minding on the walk home." "We'll not keep you much longer, Mrs. Pemberton," said Mrs. Hudson, and the woman nodded and withdrew again, and the small domestic interruption seemed somehow to settle something in the room rather than disturb it. A gentle reminder, offered without any urgency at all, that the evening, like all evenings, had its natural edges, and that the four of them were nearing one of them now. Lestrade rose first, stretching with the particular caution of a man whose knees had spent 30 years on cold pavements and had never quite forgiven him for it, and began, unbidden, gathering the tea things onto the tray with the same unthinking care he'd shown pouring them hours before, the cups stacked neatly, the spoons collected, the small ceremony of tidying that had become, over the years, as much a part of the Cold Case Club's Thursday ritual as the stories themselves. "Leave the pot," said Mrs. Hudson, folding her mending, that same sock, Wiggins noted privately, with the same private amusement he always felt at the sight of it, no closer to finish than it had been the week before, nor, he suspected, than it would be the week after that. "Mrs. Pemberton likes to see to the pot herself, says nobody scours it properly but her, and I've learned not to argue the point." "You've learned not to argue a great many points with Mrs. Pemberton," said Lestrade, setting the tray down near the door, "which I confess I find rather remarkable, given that you argued a good many points over the years with a man rather harder to argue with than any tea-shop keeper in London." "I argued with Mr. Holmes," said Mrs. Hudson, with the particular dignity of a woman who had earned the right to say his name lightly after so many years, "because Mr. Holmes needed arguing with regularly, or he'd have forgotten to eat, forgotten to sleep, and very likely forgotten there was a world outside his own experiments at all. Mrs. Pemberton, by contrast, knows precisely what she's doing with a teapot, and has done for longer than any of us have known her, and I see no reason to correct a woman who's already right." There was a small ripple of laughter at that, and Wiggins, closing the clasp on his own small wooden case, the clockwork mechanism within it, whatever it had been, evidently no further along than it had been at the start of the evening, the whole exercise having been, as it so often was, less about the mending of clocks than about giving his hand something familiar to do, while his ears did the more important work of listening. Rose as well, and reached for his coat. "I'll walk you as far as the corner, Mrs. Hudson," he said, "seeing as the fog's coming up and you'll not want to be navigating it alone, however well you know these streets." "I know these streets rather better than you'd credit," said Mrs. Hudson, though she said it fondly, and made no move to refuse the offer, "but I'll not say no to the company all the same." Watson remained seated a moment longer than the others, the dispatch box still resting on his knee, and there was in his stillness something Lestrade recognised well enough not to hurry, the particular unwillingness of a man to leave a good story's afterglow before it had quite finished settling in him. "You're not sorry you told it?" Lestrade asked quietly, once the other two had stepped out through the curtain toward the vestibule, their voices carrying back faintly, warm and unhurried, discussing which route home would best avoid the worst of the fog. "Off the canal." Watson considered the question properly before answering, in the manner of a man who had learned, over a great many years of medical practice, and a great many more of friendship with a man who valued precision above nearly everything else, not to give quick answers to questions that deserved slow ones. "No," he said at last. "I kept it private for a long while, you understand. Nearly 30 years, if you count from the events themselves rather than from when I first heard the whole of it from Thorn. I told myself for most of that time that I kept it back because it wasn't mine to tell, that Halloway's privacy mattered more than my own satisfaction in the telling, and that Holmes's quiet arrangement with Thorn, which he'd gone to such lengths to keep concealed even from Halloway himself, would somehow be dishonoured by my speaking of it too freely to strangers." He paused and looked down at the dispatch box, and there was something in his face, in that low firelight, that seemed considerably older than the rest of him, and considerably younger, both at once. But I think, if I'm honest with you, old friend, the truer reason I kept it back so long was simply that I wasn't ready to let it go. Some stories, once you've told them, belong a little less entirely to you afterward. I wanted to keep this one to myself a while longer, not out of any real secrecy, but out of something closer to a kind of tenderness. I wanted for a good many years to be the only person left in the world who still thought of Thomas Halloway on quiet evenings, and wondered how his life had gone, and hoped, without any particular reason to doubt it, that it had gone well. "And now?" said Lestrade. "Now," said Watson, rising at last and tucking the dispatch box under one arm with the same careful, unhurried gesture Halloway himself, all those years before, had used to carry a very different sort of box down a very different street. "Now I find I don't mind sharing him. I think, in fact, he would rather have liked it. A room of strangers, sitting by a fire on a rainy evening, thinking well of him without ever knowing his face, or needing to." They stepped out through the curtain together, into the small vestibule where Wiggins and Mrs. Hudson stood waiting, already deep in some gentle disagreement about the shortest route to Mrs. Hudson's lodgings, that neither of them showed any real sign of wanting resolved quickly, and Mrs. Pemberton appeared from the front of the shop with their coats already gathered from the hooks, handing them round with the brisk, unfussy competence of a woman who had performed this same small service every Thursday evening for longer than any of them cared to count. "Same time next week, I take it," she said, holding the door. "Same time next week," said Watson, and there was something in the simple repetition of it, the sheer, comfortable ordinariness of a promise that had been kept, unbroken for so many years now that none of them any longer thought to remark upon it, that felt, in that moment, like its own small kind of resolution, every bit as gentle and as warm as anything in the story he'd just finished telling. Outside, the rain had indeed stopped, exactly as Mrs. Pemberton had promised, though the street was slicked wet and gleaming under the gas lamps, each one wearing its own soft blurred halo in the thickening fog off the canal, and the four of them stood a moment on the step, in no particular hurry to separate, breathing in the cool, damp coal-smoke air of a London evening that had, for a few hours, made room for an old story to be told properly and well. "I'll see the ladies safely to their corner," said Lestrade, falling into step beside Mrs. Hudson, with the old easy protectiveness of a policeman's habit that 30 years of retirement had done nothing whatsoever to dislodge. "And then it's home for me, before Mrs. Lestrade starts imagining I've taken up a second career in muffin theft." "Give her our regards," said Watson. "I will, though she'll only ask when you're all coming to dinner again, and I'll have no good answer for her, same as always." They parted at the corner in the unhurried, affectionate way of people who had said good night to one another so many times across so many years that the gesture had worn itself smooth, like a stone handled often. Lestrade and Mrs. Hudson turning north together into the fog, their voices trailing back, low and companionable. Wiggins peeling off toward Clerkenwell with a last wave of one ink-stained hand, and Watson himself standing a moment longer on the wet pavement, alone, the dispatch box tucked snug beneath his arm, watching the gas lamps recede one by one into the soft grey distance until the fog had taken the last of his friends from view. He did not hurry home. There seemed no particular reason to. The night was mild enough for late in the year, the fog more gentle than threatening, wrapping the sleeping city in something that felt, if a man let it, rather more like a blanket than a hazard, and Watson walked slowly, unbothered, past darkened shop fronts and quiet, dripping eaves, past a single cab clattering home somewhere unseen behind the mist, past all the small, sleeping ordinariness of a London that had gone for the night gently and thoroughly to bed. He thought, as he walked, of Halloway, not the thin young man on the cold street corner this time, but the older one, the one he had never met and never would, the father, the husband, the quiet clerk grown into a quiet, settled man, standing perhaps even now at some window of his own, somewhere in the fog-wrapped city, entirely unaware that 4 strangers had spent an evening loving him for a kindness he had gone to such trouble to keep unknown. Watson found, turning the thought over as he walked, that this did not trouble him in the least. Some kindnesses, he thought, were meant to travel exactly that way, outward, quietly, gathering warmth as they went, entirely indifferent to whether the person who began them ever knew how far they'd reached. He reached his own door at last, let himself in, and set the dispatch box down on the hall table, not troubling this time to carry it up to its usual place among his papers. There would be another Thursday. There would, he rather thought, be a great many more Thursdays yet, God and health willing, and other files waiting in other drawers, other small unfinished stories that 4 old friends might yet gather round a fire to close, gently, one warm room and one rainy evening at a time. Outside, the fog thickened further still, settling soft and grey over the wet slate roofs of Marylebone, over the whole sleeping breadth of the city beyond it, and somewhere, in a house Watson had never seen and never would, a small wooden music box sat on a mantelpiece, dusted weekly, wound occasionally, playing on for a family who loved it without ever quite knowing why, and that, he thought, settling at last into his own chair by his own low fire, was very nearly the best ending any story could hope to be given. The rain, wherever it had got to, kept on somewhere over the rooftops, patient as ever, in no hurry at all.